Congressman, thank you so very much for being with us. And as I say, we appreciate your involvement and your team's involvement in our chamber. Thank you, sir, and we're glad to have you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Ken and Jeff and everybody at the North Dallas Chamber. We have had quite a year and a half together, starting off, of course, with you having this great new building and now the tornado and, of course, this pandemic. And, of course, I think we have to begin there with us now topping 1,000 cases for several days in a row in Dallas County. And you know, Ken, I remember the last time we spoke, I think we were somewhere in the 200s and we were, you know, worried about that. And, you know, we're seeing what exponential growth can do. And, you know, it's a really, really difficult and dangerous moment for us, particularly because, you know, as we were reopening parts of our economy, we are now having to roll back some of those reopenings for public health purposes. And I think that was the right decision. And I agree with the steps that Judge Jenkins has taken. And I think that the statewide masking ordinance that's in place is also the right decision because, you know, as much as we want to move on from this virus, it has not moved on from us. And it's still very much with us. And particularly for our young people, with I think about over half of our cases in Dallas County recently have come from folks who are in the 18 to 39 age range. We are seeing that, you know, some of these settings where folks have been able to gather have been events where the virus has spread, and it's a real danger to us. And of course, it's got an economic impact, and that's the thing that I think, you know, in addition to the public health side, that we are all so concerned about is that, as I've said from the beginning, and as I think we all recognize, you know, our public health and our economic health are tied together, and we are not going to be able to recover economically and get back to some version of normal. It won't be the previous version, but some version of normal until we are able to defeat this virus on the public health side. And so to do that, you know, some of the steps that have been put in place, I think, are necessary. But for us as policymakers, I see our job as having to make sure that while there are industries and there are businesses that have to, for public health purposes, close, you know, venues, indoor dining areas in restaurants, bars, that while those areas have to close through no fault of their own, through no mistake that they've made, but simply for public health purposes, that we have to support them and make sure they can get through this crisis and hopefully, of course, keep their employees on the books. And so that when we do emerge from this, we still have those businesses and we still have those places that attract people and have been attracting people to North Texas for years now. And I think they are really, really important economic engines for us. I mean, I don't have to tell you all that tourism in terms of folks coming to Dallas and coming to North Texas has become a much larger part of our economy than it was previously. And we are a destination. And so we want people to be able to come here for conferences, for meetings, to be able to go to good restaurants, to be able to have fun and go out and some of our great locations that we have. But some of those same industries won't survive this crisis if we don't help them out. And so that's why it is important that we have taken the steps we've taken with PPP, with the recent bill that I think created some much needed flexibility around that program, adjusting the formula to 60-40 from the previous 75-25 for wages and other costs, also extending the period that you can apply and extending the period that it applies to. I think that those are critical steps. I'm also a co-sponsor of a bill to try and allow folks to take another dip into the PPP program if they need to, particularly because in some parts of the country and here in Texas as well, there are some industries that are having to go back into lockdown that weren't previously. And so, you know, we have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot to talk about on the economic side. And I think that we've taken some good steps, but I'm interested in hearing always what we can be doing better. And PPP was a program that we stood up quite quickly, and that obviously had some, I think, rough days early on, particularly from the really small businesses that were having trouble getting access to credit, the folks who maybe had not needed to get access to credit before. And I'm particularly concerned with, you know, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, some of these businesses that really have not always had the greatest access to credit, and that at the beginning of this crisis we heard a lot of stories that they were struggling to get access to some of the loans that were being issued. That I think has evened out some, and I'm glad to see that. But y'all can always help me understand how that's operating and understand what we need to be doing to make PPP work better and what other steps need to be taken. And so I think for us on the public health side that we have to shift our stance. We are and have been in a mostly defensive stance, and it's been important what we've done in terms of our stay-at-home orders that we previously had, in terms of some of the other restrictions that we put in place around gatherings. Those are important steps, but what the countries around the world who've done the best with taking on this virus have done is they've been very aggressive about hunting down the virus, identifying where it is through testing and very rapid testing, getting rapid results, very aggressive contact tracing in terms of helping people know who has come into contact with something and finding out everyone who's had that contact, and then helping them quarantine and isolate, which we know that most folks can't do in their own homes. And there was a bipartisan plan that was put forward months ago now by Scott Gottlieb, former director of the FDA in the Trump administration, and Andy Slavitt, who was an Obama healthcare official, around doing those things and trying to build on sort of the South Korean model that we did incorporate into the HEROES Act that we passed. And I hope that we can see that get passed in the Senate, or at least some parts of it get passed, because I think that will be very important. The other thing that we did in the HEROES Act that I think is really that we should discuss here this morning is covering the revenue shortfalls for our states and municipalities, because what we're looking at here in North Texas and in the state of Texas is that we're going to have enormous shortfalls of the revenue that the cities, counties, and the state government expected to be coming in, and that will not be coming in. And that has already caused cuts. We've seen over 500 employees furloughed from the city of Dallas. They will have to take very aggressive additional steps soon if they don't get their revenue shortfalls covered. And the state has enacted a 5% cut, I think, across the board, and will likely have to take deeper cuts than that. And what we're talking about here is education, it's essential services, it's our safety net hospitals that will be impacted. We have to make sure that as we see these revenue shortfalls, that the only entity that can take that on is the federal government, because our cities, our counties, our states cannot operate in the red. So they will have to make cuts. So if they have 25% less coming in, they will just have to cut 25%. And that's going to cut deep in some of the services that we require and that we need, not only for economic health, but particularly during this public health crisis, to combat what's happening. And so it's the exact wrong time, I think, for us to see those cuts be put in place. And so I hope we can cover that. We did that in the HEROES Act. We had about $1 trillion to cover those costs and those that reduction in revenue. Obviously, the Senate has not taken that part up, but I hope that in our next negotiated package that I do think will have to happen, and that the White House and others have said is going to happen, that will be included in it, because that's going to be critical for us. And finally, since we have some of our National Chamber folks here, I just want to thank them and mention the award that they recently honored me with for the Spirit of Enterprise Award, highlighting some of the bipartisan work that I've done in Congress, particularly around the USMCA. I think earned a 95% bipartisanship score. So that was nice, and I appreciate the recognition from the chamber. But I've always said, and I truly believe this, that our business community in North Texas is some of our most responsible entities and institutions that we have left, and that I think, have the capability and the capacity to reach across the aisle to find consensus and to help stop bad things from happening, things like the bathroom bill, things like that, and promote smart things like investment in our infrastructure, investment in our education system. And I've always appreciated the North Dallas Chamber and our regional chamber here for doing that, for being a part of what I think makes us stronger as an area and as a country, for supporting things like immigration reform to help us deal with some of the workforce. And so, I'm happy to be with y'all. I know this is a very difficult time, and I want to just say that, we've seen some positive things in the economy, but we, of course, are in a recession. We are in a global recession. The global supply chains will be hit hard and will have some difficulty coming back. We're an area that also, of course, has a very strong aviation sector to our economy, through our airports, through our airlines that are headquartered here, through all the businesses that work around that support that, from parking to vendors, providing food. It's a huge part of our economy, and that has taken an enormous hit, even though we have tried to bail out the airlines in our first CARES Act package. That's still just been an enormous hit for us. And so some of these impacts are going to have long tails on them, and it's going to be a long fight. And I want to, not to preach any doom and gloom here, but we are in for a long fight with COVID-19. We are not approaching the end of this, as we're seeing nearly every day with record cases and, most concerningly, record hospitalizations and the wear and tear that that's taking on our frontline healthcare workers. This is an extremely dangerous time for us. It is still very, very much not safe. It is still an extremely challenging time to have any kind of an economy like we have here. That's with some of the things that are being impacted. And so we have a lot of work to do, and it's going to take us working at the federal, state, local levels in government, and as well as private industry, to not only get through this, but to understand how we can keep as many folks afloat as possible going through this. Because what none of us want to see is we emerge, let's say March, April next year, with a vaccine that allows us to start returning to some semblances of normal life, and we have 30-40% of our small businesses are no longer there. That is not an outcome that any of us want to see, and it's certainly one that I think would have just long-term impacts, because these are also the same businesses that provide the best paying jobs in our areas, that keep the revenues of what they make and earn in our community because they are local, then they spend that money in our community, and so the impact is worse for us than, say a national chain being impacted or something like that when we lose a small business. So that's been my focus, and we're going to continue to try and figure out all the things we can do to help. Just so everyone knows, we still have 130 billion or so left in the PPP program. So for folks who are out there who are still, if you come across anyone who still is looking for funding for that, there is still funding available. I've heard anecdotally from a lot of folks that they've had better experiences with local lenders than with some of the national lenders, the national banks. And so we'll see, but obviously anyone who you have a lending relationship with, you should go to first. But there is still money available, and we will, I'm sure, if that money runs out, provide more funding. And the final thing I'll just mention, since I think this is the first time we've spoken, Ken and Jeff, since this happened, is that recently we saw the Garland VA Medical Center open up for services, taking over the old Baylor Scott and White Hospital there that had been shuttered since 2018. And that was something, of course, that was my top priority. It's one of the things that I think we spent probably the most time on trying to make happen. I'll be very honest with you, there were many, many times when it was seemed like that was a project that was not going to happen and that was going to end up falling kind of through the cracks, but we were able to keep all the various players at the table. And it's a really big deal for Garland, and it's a really big deal for North Texas, because it does and it will give us a center to treat 184,000 veterans much more conveniently. It's also going to create around 5,000 jobs, and just the cost of the facility itself. For us, when I spoke with the National VA on one of our calls when they were considering pulling out of the deal, the cost for us to build a similar facility, because of government contracting and a lot of other things, it's around $800 million to $1 billion to build a similar facility. And the cost for us to sort of retrofit and fix up the old Baylor Scott and White Hospital that had been not that long ago refurbished was only around $20 million for this year. And so it's an enormous savings to the taxpayer. It's the right thing for our veterans. And it's a COVID overflow location. Should our hospitals run out of capacity, they do have the capacity to take on around 200 COVID patients. And as we're seeing, unfortunately, that may become necessary. So it's also very timely. And it's one of the things that I've been most proud of here in my first term. So with that, I'm happy to jump into questions, but thank you all so much for the honor representing you and working with you in Congress. I've always enjoyed all of our chats, both virtual and in person, and look forward to hearing about some of the things we can do better here. And I know that if we don't touch anything today, y'all can always reach out to us and we'll find a way to talk about it later as well.
Thank you, Congressman, for that update. First question from me. As you know, back in October, we were hit by a pretty severe tornado, damaging lots of residential homes and commercial buildings, including our chamber building. Can you give us an update on what's happening on the FEMA perspective and with the denial of the claim and where we go next on that?
Yeah, that was a real frustration. As a real, I think, mistake from FEMA. It seems to me that they are actively trying to find ways to deny that funding instead of trying to work with us, because even if our initial application didn't meet the threshold without the DISD funding in there, as you know, Jeff, that was added in the appeal, and we certainly met the threshold. There's just no doubt about it, unless you try to play some games with dividing up how the costs apply. And that appears to be what happened. And so our appeal has been turned down, and that's something that on a bipartisan basis, I led all of my colleagues who had tornado damage. We all led a letter from the House side. As you know, our two senators led letters from the Senate side. The governor made the request. So, this is a bipartisan, total effort to try and get this funding. And unfortunately, I think we may have run into a brick wall there. And the problem is that the costs won't go away for the city and for the county. They'll just be passed on locally. And that's just what we're looking at right now. And that's, again, to the point around the revenue shortfalls that our cities and states and counties are facing, is that on top of that, we had this really, really extremely damaging event just before the pandemic hit. And so, I know Eddie Bernice Johnson and I are going to continue to work to find if there's a way through legislation that we can direct funding, but we don't have the capability anymore to do earmarking, so that won't be direct allocation, but to try and see what we can do, through maybe some legislation. But the prospects are not looking great, and I think that it was a mistake by FEMA. And I'll just say, we pay into the system that then provides this aid, and this is the exact kind of scenario in which that aid should be provided. This is the natural disaster comes through, hits a city, takes out, causes tens of millions of dollars worth of damage. That is the exact incident that we pay into the system for. And so it's extremely frustrating, and I think it was a mistake by the administration.
Thanks for that. Next question is with regards to infrastructure and transportation. I know one of your priorities for your term has been trying to improve the infrastructure, and you spoke at our Transportation Crossroads conference last year about that. Tell us where things are at right now in terms of getting an infrastructure bill passed and some of your priorities there.
Yeah. Well, we passed in the House our Moving America Forward Act that was about a $1.5 trillion infrastructure package. Not all of that was what you would think of in terms of roads and bridges and transit. There was also high-speed internet. There was also housing. There was also funding for school construction, because a lot of our schools around the country need to be rebuilt. And I think that we are clearly right now in the mediation phase of this crisis, where we're trying to mediate and we're trying to deal with the negative impacts of COVID-19, and we're trying to just get through this crisis. But looming out there for us are a number of investments that we haven't made for decades, and we're really still relying on the Eisenhower era infrastructure that we invested in the 50s, and we have not really made a serious investment in since. And so, what that just means is that we're relying on aging and crumbling infrastructure. Here in Texas, through TxDOT, we've used very complicated funding mechanisms to try and build some of the things we need on the road side. That's why we do have so many toll roads now in place, and that is in many ways a good thing, because we certainly need that for the traffic and to alleviate some of that traffic that we have. But on the flip side, of course, that means that, we have we're one of the most tolled areas in terms of, especially Collin County, is basically bracketed by toll roads. And so, we have a lot of very serious investments we need to make. And it's not just the things we see, our roads and our bridges. It's also our high-speed internet that I think we're learning now how critical that is. I mean, the Dallas Morning News had a story a few months ago about that about a third of kids in DISD don't have access to high-speed internet. I mean, that's extremely concerning for us, particularly when we're trying to do distance learning, but really just to compete in this economy, to engage in learning of any kind, whether it's in person or not, you need to be able to have access to that. So we want to expand that. And, we're going to have to be much more creative, Jeff, with the space that we have. And so, we're not going to be able to add a whole lot more highways. I mean, it's just not going to be something that will work for us. We already are doing, I think we have more roadways than most places. So we're going to be much more efficient with the space that we have through the use of big data, through AI, through, yes, our cars communicating with one another so that they can be more efficient on the roadway. And we're going to have to diversify the transportation options that folks have. And so, Jeff, I know you and I both are interested in DART, and DART has some good things and some things that we need to work on to make it, more easier for folks to use in everyday life and to be more convenient. And I think that some of the changes they've made recently around through their app, where you can both use a ride sharing and take a DART and take a ride sharing, so that last mile part is covered, I think is good progress, but we need to do more. And we had some really, I think, groundbreaking investments in trying to make our cities more bikeable, more walkable, more friendly for folks to be able to get around. This is something that most cities are moving towards around the country. And we're seeing, I think, the evidence during this pandemic, people closing roads, making them into pedestrian-only areas. You, Jeff, have done an incredible job with our trails. And my uncle, as you know, has taken quite a lot of advantage of that. And those are things that add to our life in our area and make it a better place to live. And there's smart investments, they're investments that then attract people here. And so when you look at things like, how do we get, when the next Amazon type thing happens, how do we make North Texas the destination that gets that contract, that becomes the choice? It is things like that. It's like, it's having a city that isn't overburdened by traffic, but that also has other ways to get around on public transportation, on rail, through biking, building walkable neighborhoods, making it friendly, and greener as well. We're learning how important it is to have more trees, more green space. It's not just, it's not just environmental, it's also economic. And so those are the investments that we need to make. And the only entity that can really draw those resources together and direct it is the federal government. And so we have kind of had an inverse relationship in recent years where the investment the federal government used to take on has flipped. And we are now taking that on at the state and local level. That's why you saw a couple of ballot measures in the last election for us to tax ourselves for infrastructure spending to try and take up some of the slack the federal government has withdrawn from. We need to change that and make sure that, because there are some projects that are, cross state lines, cross municipal lines that only the federal government can direct and only the federal government can provide the resources for. And those kind of long-term investments require us to make those smart decisions. And I think that the bill we passed, the Moving America Forward Act, is a really good one, and one that, whether it's in this Congress or the next one, many parts of that will become law and will happen. With this administration, they've said from the beginning they want to do infrastructure. We want to do infrastructure. I hope we can find a way at some point to actually do that. And the final thing I'll mention, Jeff, is the high-speed rail project, because we're still pushing for that. And even with this crisis that we've gone through, I think that it's still one of the most exciting projects for us for a lot of reasons. If you're an environmentalist, it takes a lot of cars off the road, and it is something that will help the environment. For business, we're talking about connecting the fourth and fifth largest municipal areas in the country, in Houston and Dallas and the DFW area, by a 90-minute high-speed train. Jeff, I'm sure like me, you've made that flight and or drive many times, and neither are a very good option. And right now, 90% of the trips between Dallas and Houston are by car. And so if we can provide another option that is convenient, that is better for the environment, and that diversifies, again, to come back to that, diversifies the options that folks have to get around with our growth, those are the smart things we have to do. So, we need to make these investments. Really, honestly, infrastructure is not a want to, it's a must. This is not something we want to do. The only question is, are we going to do it too late? And that's really the only question. We are going to eventually make these infrastructure investments. The American College of Engineers has said that we're $3 trillion behind on what we need to do to bring our national infrastructure up to speed. This is, sort of a down payment on that, the bill that we passed. But, we're going to end up doing this. And the final thing I'll say, and I said that already, is for us, workforce is going to continue to be part of the bottleneck. And so, I'm very glad that our local school districts and our community colleges are working with our trades and working with our businesses to try and turn out folks who have the skills that we need so that when we do rebuild America and when we do get to the work of investing in our future, that we have the skilled workforce that can actually implement that. And that's going to continue to be a bottleneck for us. And I know, I'm sure y'all have heard about this, but every skilled business owner, every skilled worker that we have out there tells me that we just don't have enough. And the pipeline needs to be expanded. And that's another big focus, even though it's not specifically infrastructure related.
Thank you, Congressman. And I especially appreciate your words with regard to the trails and connections and alternate means of transportation besides cars. I think, as many of you all know, these projects are oftentimes funded through federal, state, county, and local sources, and many times are collaborative efforts. So we appreciate the federal support for these kinds of initiatives. With that, I'm going to open it up to some of the questions from within our guests. And the first question is going to come from Priscilla Camacho. Priscilla, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Good afternoon, Congressman Allred. Good to see you again. So you talked about workforce, so it's perfect for, I now work at the Alamo Colleges District in San Antonio. And so I'll speak on behalf of myself and a lot of other community colleges across the state. Two questions, one on continued or potential COVID recovery funds. And do you see, or how likely do you see the next recovery package, including some increased investments in higher ed and specifically workforce development programs? We've seen bits and pieces in the HEROES Act, the Relaunching America's Workforce Act, and then you talked about HR 2 has a little bit of that in there. And I know the Senate just filed a bill last week that had some significant investments included in there. So I just wanted to get your thoughts and what you're hearing from your colleagues in the House and how likely that will those kinds of investments will be included.
Yeah, well, good to see you, Priscilla. I'm sorry, that you've switched roles, but it's always good to see you. And we have a great community college network here in North Texas, and it is a jewel for us. It is something that I think many folks don't know about North Texas who aren't from here, but it also changes a lot of lives. And, whether we're talking about Richland or El Centro, I guess they're changing their name, but, there are so many institutions here that I think provide young people graduating from our schools a chance to get into a really good paying job. And you're right, Priscilla, the big concern for many of us around higher ed is the cuts that you're going to experience, not only in terms of money coming in, but you're going to have additional costs to try and keep people safe when they come into your doors, or to try and teach virtually. You're taking on additional costs. So it's the exact wrong time for us to see your funding get cut, and that's part of why we want to cover some of the state shortfalls, because we will see, as we did with the last recession, 08-09, when the state of Texas made some deep cuts to its investment in our higher ed to deal with their revenue shortfall. That will happen again. And so, we want to avoid that, and we don't want to see that happen. You're also right, of course, that we haven't really had that in any of our, substantive legislation hasn't been directly addressing that. And it hasn't raised on some of the conference calls that I've been on discussing it. And I do think that it's something that we all want to see done. It hasn't been something that has been part of the negotiations from what I've heard for the next round, unfortunately. But I want to thank you for raising it. Now I'm going to ask my staff if we can reach out to our chairman of the Education and Labor Committee and kind of see what the discussions are around that, because we have heard, we are actively talking about for this next K through 12 and covering some of their additional costs and making sure we don't lose a bunch of teachers during this crisis. But higher ed is a real concern for all of us, particularly since we do have and will continue to have these workforce issues that we really need to be working on. So thank you for raising it. It's really important to me. Feedback there.
Reminder that if you're not speaking, please mute. Thank you.
No, and I appreciate that, Congressman. And anything that you can do, I know locally, I'm one of your colleagues and friends, Representative Castro is one of the co-authors of that Relaunching America's Workforce Act. And we've been having some deep conversations with him about that concern, because specifically with community colleges, workforce development is going to be critical to upskilling and reskilling those that are unemployed. And as you mentioned, higher ed will likely get cut, and they've already gotten cut at a statewide level. And so, but we're going to be tapped to do that work and with less resources. And so anything that you and your team and others can do to really kind of push that forward would be definitely appreciated, because we are going to see increased need, but we're fearful that we're not going to get the kind of investment to actually sustain that and do that to the level that we need to.
Yeah. I'll talk to Joaquin about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Priscilla, for that. Next question is from our friend Diana Einstein with the Mayor Star Council. Diana, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, Colin. So great to see you. So we have just accepted our 9th class of Mayor Star Council, young civic leaders such as yourself. And it will be our first year starting virtually. And so it's a different world to live in this COVID world now and make true impact. And so my question for you really is, how can we guide our upstanders, our young civic leaders, to make true impact, but also be incredibly safe?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Diana. And, I enjoyed speaking to your last class, and, maybe I can speak virtually to this class. And it's a great program, and I'm so glad that y'all are doing that. And, I think that right now is one of the most difficult points that we've had in quite some time for our country. Not only with COVID, but also with the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests and movement that have swept the nation. But I also think that in many ways, this is an opportunity for young civic-minded leaders to get involved on the ground floor of really, really meaningful change. We are having more honest discussions now than we've had in my lifetime around race and around inequality. We're talking about, like with Jeff's work on trails and roads and walkable cities and making our cities greener and work better and better to live in. Those also, I think, have a very large civil rights component to it. And so if you're interested in at all in transformative change, moments of inflection are also moments of opportunity to be a part of that change. And so, I think that there is going to be, enormous legislation. There already has. We've already passed over $3 trillion worth of aid to deal with this at the federal level, but at the state and local level, there's going to be really important decisions being made on so many different levels, from policing to, city planning to infrastructure to education, that this is a time, I think, to make sure that these young folks are exposed to that they can maybe have a voice in that, and they may teach the folks who are doing it something, because they often, my experience has been, when talking to these folks, they have great ideas, are paying very close attention. And because of maybe being a little younger, they are not bounded by some of the old rules always. And I think they, have opportunities to kind of expose things and open our eyes at, folks who are policymakers to things that we might have not thought possible previously. So, I would like to see us, if we can, emerge from these crises as, a more united country, a country and a community that is more honest with itself and that is working to address our challenges while also recognizing, our progress. And, that I think is a very, very interesting time to be a young person involved in civics, in governance. This is a time in which they can make a huge impact. And so, we have interns that work with us who I think are being exposed to things that are going to be written about in history books, and your class will be as well. And as much as possible, now that we are not gathering in person, we still, I think, have to keep our commitment to being open and accessible, especially to young people. And so I hope all of our various levels of government will find ways to make sure that they can be involved and make their voice heard through this process. I know we're trying hard to do that, but please let us know if there's anything you think that we can do to help your class kind of be engaged with what we're thinking about. At the city level, I talked about some of the decisions. There's going to be some tough decisions being made, and there already are. And I think there's quite a bit for them to witness and to see and to understand the rationale behind it. And I think we all need to be thinking right now, what are we going to look like on the other side of this? And that to me is an area where young people are going to be indispensable.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Diana, for the question. Next question is from Jennifer Chandler with Bank of America. Jennifer, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being on the call today. And I just want to personally thank you for all that you've done for businesses, and in particular, the PPP program. I've seen firsthand how important that work is. And to the point you made earlier, we've got a long road ahead of us. Just wanted to see if you could speak more to how large employers like ourselves, Bank of America, some of the larger firms can help with this continued efforts, knowing, again, we've got a long road ahead of us, whether it's CDFIs, MDIs. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, you're right. I think that CDFIs and our minority-owned lenders, we set aside, I think, $60 billion in our last round of funding to try and make sure we got it there. But our big institutions, I think, have a really critical role to play in helping us reach really into the small business community. And what I mean by that is not your well-established small businesses that are sophisticated, that have had access to credit in the past, that know how to navigate these processes. It's our mom and pop shops. It's our self-employed, or the folks who are just getting off the ground, and it's our folks who, for one reason or another, have not historically had access to credit, that we're having the hardest time reaching with these programs. And so I know that y'all have some programs in place to try and do that, but I really encourage you to be as aggressive as possible in outreach and trying to be proactive in kind of finding out where the need is, and trying to form those relationships. And I do think that it's going to be, of course, in the long-term interests of y'all as lenders as well. I mean, in addition to adding new folks to your roles. I mean, this is the overall economic health, of course, that we're talking about here. And these are, I think, really important employers that they may only have 2 or 3 employees, but they pay them well, and their profits stay in the community. And if they go, we all really lose something. And so those are the areas of the economy that I'm most worried about. I think that the chairman of the Federal Reserve, said that our most vulnerable have been hurt the hardest, by this, and that we're going to have to do more on the economic side to help those areas, because I think what we can emerge from this where we've deepened the already existing inequalities, where we've broadened and widened the challenges we already faced in terms of, minority ownership of businesses, women ownership of businesses, veteran-owned businesses, that we need to be closing those gaps. And, recessions, of course, always, it's a last in, first out sort of economic struggle. But, for us, I think the long-term impacts of that, the tail of that, mean that, we'll have then mortgage problems down the road. We'll have education issues down the road. We'll have local funding reduced because of reduced revenue. So, I mean, it just has a long tail, these crises. And I know you know this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But, I think particularly for our national institutions that have the workforce ability, and you have the capacity, and you have the folks who are talented and who are able to do it, to be really aggressive in identifying and targeting and reaching out and educating, our folks out there about what they could have access to. And then you may need to do, a bit more work than you would with a more sophisticated, entity, but I think it'll be more rewarding in many ways too. So.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jennifer, for that question. Next question is from our friend Matt Acosta. Matt, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Colin. It's good to see you and Judith. It's been a while. Thanks for all the good work. Texas 32 made a great decision, obviously. So my question has to do with the impending, if not present, eviction crisis. Unfortunately, PPP has more to do with wages and staffing and rent for small businesses. And if you know, I moved to a partially real estate firm, and from the folks I'm talking to, multifamily real estate owners and investors, they want to do the right thing. And they just see, if they continue to do it long term, they have complex issues that they're going to have to deal with. And then also, obviously, on an individual level, nobody wants to be homeless. And that's just a crisis that needs to be addressed. So I've been hearing, obviously, there's going to be a second round of PPP. PPP has been extended, but are we going to get, or is there discussion about federal dollars going specifically to housing and individuals needing to pay rent?
Yeah, and thank you, Matt. It's always good to see you. You're absolutely right. Particularly during a pandemic, when we're asking folks to stay home if they can, and to stay safe, to have people losing their homes is a real problem. And also for the landowners, landlords, for them to be having a number of folks not able to pay and having no revenue coming in for them, but that they still have their bills due. We recognize that is a huge crisis for them as well. And we don't want to see. We are already underhoused in North Texas, and we already need to expand access to housing and access to affordable housing in particular. So this crisis is obviously exposing that and could deepen it. And in the HEROES Act, we did have $100 billion in emergency rental assistance to try and shore up, trying to make sure folks can stay in their homes and try to get through this period. And that basically takes us to the end of the year is the way we imagine that. And there are some other housing components in the HEROES Act that I think we can talk about it if you want to offline, but that I think are trying to aim at that. But we need to have consensus, and we need to have our colleagues in the Senate have to join us in this. And I don't think, I hope at least, that this won't be a partisan issue, because this will, regardless of sort of your view on economic theory, this is folks largely who have, through no fault of their own, are either unemployed or underemployed or are making much less than they were previously. And that is not because they don't want to be working. It's not because they're not, trying to do the right things. It's just because their particular part of the economy has been decimated by this virus. And so they should be able to stay in their home, both from a public health perspective and a long-term economic health perspective. And so, if the HEROES Act, in the next package that I know is being negotiated and that's going to end up passing, and I don't know, the HEROES Act was $3 trillion. I've heard from the White House $2 trillion. So I think we will have a package. I think there will be a housing component. I don't know if it'll be everything we had in the HEROES Act, but there was in the CARES Act. I think there will be in the HEROES Act as well, whenever that does pass. And I think there should be. And you're absolutely right. We can't during a pandemic. And I think Judge Jenkins has done the right thing, I should say, also in Dallas County through the JOPs, the Justice of the Peace, not enforcing some of these evictions and things like that. I think it's the right thing when we're seeing record cases and record hospitalizations to not have a lot of people dumped out of their homes. That would be the wrong thing from the public health perspective too. So thank you for that, Matt, and keep an eye on it. I think you will see something happening. It may not be as ambitious as what I would like to see happen, perhaps, but I do think we'll end up on some sort of agreement there.
Thanks, Matt, for submitting that question. And thanks to everybody who has submitted questions so far. I'm sorry we will not have the chance to get to all of them. But if you have follow-up questions for the Congressman, Congressman, do you want to introduce your staff on the call? And if people have follow-up questions, they can email Judith and your team?
Yeah, so my district director, Judith Tinkle, is our point of contact here locally for folks. And you can always, of course, go to our website at allred.house.gov. And we also have a small business guide on there. I think it's /COVID-19 small business for folks who want to download the small business guide. But on there, they have our number. I think it's 972-972-7949. So you can give us a call. We are also working remotely, but we are still fully staffed and taking calls. And it's actually been a very busy time for constituent work. And so as you might imagine, so please reach out to us anytime. I know Judith is willing, and we'll make sure that we pass anything up the chain that we need to. But particularly for our local chambers, I think that you play such a critical role in not only disseminating information of what we do, but also in passing up things to be concerned about that's happening locally. And so I always appreciate our open lines of communication, and I'm sure we'll continue to do that. But please, anytime, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be there to help.
Thanks, Congressman. We have time for a very quick question from Ken Malcolmson. Ken, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, I'll be more than happy to. This is, I want your opinion, Colin. Tell us, will you be able to be present in person at a Baylor football game this fall?
I went to a game last year, and Baylor is doing really well. So it would be a shame if we're not able to have folks in the stands. Being outdoors helps because it is safer to be outdoors. I don't know if we'll be able to fill stadiums because we're probably going to have to continue to follow social distancing guidelines into the fall. The thing about football, though, Ken, that I'm sure is there's so much staff around it, and there's so many people that come into it, that it's a very difficult sport to just engage in during a pandemic. Basketball, for example, I know the NBA is restarting. They're going to have them in a bubble in, I think, Orlando. And there's, I think, 13 players on an NBA roster. I'm forgetting what the exact number is. Maybe it's a little more. And they have a few coaches, and they have athletic staff, and they have some folks who work around the thing. Football is on a totally different scale. I mean, you're talking about 80 scholarships at a college, probably 20 to 40, maybe even 60 walk-ons. You also have huge staffs, huge weight training staffs, huge health staffs. So that's a lot of people coming into contact with one another. And so I am very worried about football. I'm very worried about the possibility of having massive and very rapid outbreaks within football teams. And particularly on college campuses this fall, I think it's going to be very dangerous if they don't take precautions, because these are the exact age groups that we're seeing right now are the ones who are reporting really the highest spikes in cases. Is this kind of college age folks who, we've all seen them around town, not wearing masks in times, and honestly, when I was their age, I don't know how I would have handled this crisis either, feeling as invincible as you do at that age. But I honestly, Ken, I hope that we are able to have, some form of sports, because I do think that sports, beyond having, being a lot of fun to watch and everything, I do think that it has a uniting element to it. And I do think that it's important for us culturally and societally to be able to, root for your team and not have it be all about politics for a little bit, or come together and kind of get behind, a great story, a feel-good story of a kid who came from nowhere and who is doing incredible things. Those are the stories that inspire us, and I think we've always drawn that from sports. And so it'd be a shame if we don't have it. So I hope that they can take precautions. Whether or not I will be able to make it to Waco, I don't know. But if they're playing, I'll try. So
that's great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Colin, thank you for your service to our community. Thank you for your time today and the multiple times that you've engaged with our chamber. This is very important for us to have these kinds of connections. Your staff is superb. Judith has become very close to our chamber, and we really value our relationship with her as well. So thank you for all you do. One thing that I wanted to comment on as we close is that Colin mentioned the NBA is starting up. Well, we coincidentally at the chamber, our next program is on Thursday at 10 a.m. with Ben Skin Wade of the Dallas Mavericks to talk a little bit about the opening of the NBA. So hopefully you can join us then for our next virtual program. And please stay attuned to what's happening at ndcc.org for a whole myriad of other opportunities to engage and to hear interesting speakers and topics being addressed at our chamber. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to thank Congressman Allred, obviously, and his staff. I want to thank all of you who have chosen to participate and spend this time with us today, and your engagement in the community and your interest in these very important issues. And last but not least, I want to thank our sponsors of today's event, Iberia Bank and Encore.